Hi, Brian. Nice to have you again. Today it's going to be a discussion about Myanmar, what is happening in Myanmar, and maybe why don't you give us the context, historical context, and up to what we call the constitutional coup of the beginning of the year. I think the purpose of this discussion is that is to debunk a little bit this portraying of the military as being the bad guys and Aung San Suu Kyi to be the good guys, democracy and freedom and so on. And there's no one actually trying to debunk this whole thing, just to give a more accurate image of what is actually happening in Myanmar. So could you give us maybe the background, maybe historical, and what is happening right now in Myanmar?
People are trying to depict this, especially the Western media, and of course the opposition leaders themselves. They're trying to depict this as if the military just suddenly seized power, that there was some sort of democracy happening, that the government that was ousted was democratically elected, and they're not really going into the details of what led up to that, why the military would have done that. We saw the Western media talk about things like, oh, they arrested Aung San Suu Kyi because she was using unauthorized radios or something. And as I think people who are following my work realize, that as you dig into who Aung San Suu Kyi was, who she was surrounded with, the nature of the opposition, or I should say her government once they got into power, and now they're the opposition. Once you start digging into their backgrounds, virtually every single one of them is tied directly to these foreign governments, the United States government through the National Endowment for Democracy or USAID, supposedly private corporate foundations like George Soros's Open Society. But as I've shown, there are documents that admit UK British government documents that admit the US government was working with Open Society. So they're not independent of each other, they're working together. And so her entire political party and the supposed civil society networks that support her party, this was all a creation of the US and also the British government. And there's also a role that Germany, Australia, and other Western allied governments have been playing. To call that a democratically elected government, a government that is the product of foreign intervention, is completely dishonest, completely inaccurate. It is the product of foreign interference. Democracy is a process of self-determination. Everything about Aung San Suu Kyi's government is literally being decided in foreign capitals. And we're probably going to get into her foreign advisors. She literally had foreigners surrounding her, around her constantly, just determining her policies for her. So there was no element of self-determination here at all. It was basically a modern day colonial administration that they installed into power. This is what the military removed from power.
Yes, remember there was this task force Asia Society meeting in 2009, and you had like very top people from the State Department in 2009. And in the task force, there was a Sean Turnell, which is an Australian citizen, and that became actually later a personal advisor of Aung San Suu Kyi. Could you give us a little bit the background of this task force and what was the purpose? Because you see, I went through the paper, and there was a lot about talking, not so much about democracy. It was more about how are we going to liberalize Myanmar. When you talk about liberalizing, is how we can get our hands into Myanmar state-owned assets. How we can, just get into Myanmar and make it a hostage or maybe a US pawn. So can you give us a little bit more information about this paper, this task force?
So this was put out, I'm looking at it right now, it's actually 2010, put out by Asia Society, but it's called Asia Society, but it's basically all these Western interests talking about what they want to do with Asia.
It's the Ford Foundation, right? It's the Ford Foundation behind it, huh?
Actually, there's many foundations behind it. So on the task force, you had the then chairman and CEO of USAID. You had retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. You had George Soros himself. You had Kenneth Roth from Human Rights Watch, which plays a very prominent role in using human rights to advance these self-serving agendas of the West. And of course, you said Sean Turnell, and he was an economist. He's on this task force. He also testified in front of the U.S. government, in front of Congress, and he's involved with Open Society. He's also an advisor to USAID. So he's basically like an intermediary between the U.S. government and Myanmar, because he became Aung San Suu Kyi's advisor. And this wasn't something that was a rumor or people were just accusing Aung San Suu Kyi of this. This is what he himself admits. This is what, when he was introduced in Western forums, they would introduce him as an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, an economic advisor. And you're exactly right. It's about market liberalization, which this word liberalization is supposed to sound good, but it just means taking away all barriers, protecting Myanmar's resources and ensuring that they're used for the people in Myanmar, and allowing foreign interests to just come in and extract them and to dominate the domestic markets and to extract resources and ship them out of the country. That's what that means. That's what it's liberating Myanmar's resources from its people, from its sovereignty. And if you listen to Sean Turnell in any talk that he gives, all he talks about is the IMF and the World Bank and how they need to get them in there as part of his plan to restructure Myanmar's economy. So that's what we had. We had Aung San Suu Kyi posing as the head of Myanmar's government, but in fact she had, and Sean Turnell is not the only foreign advisor. I'm going to talk about another one here in just a moment. But he is running Myanmar's economic policies, and he's directly interfaced with the U.S. government. This task force was a task force developing U.S. policy toward Myanmar, and then he's whispering into Aung San Suu Kyi's ear about policy Myanmar should adopt in regards to dealing with foreign interests. So they're working both sides, and it was basically a client regime. Aung San Suu Kyi was just a figurehead. Sean Turnell was the one coming up with the economic policy.
Yes, just you and I, we call this a hijacking of democracy. And I think it would be good if you can explain exactly, I mean, why it is not a democracy, why it is actually, it's going against the sovereignty of Myanmar, you know, in terms of so touching the media, the information, civil society, and actually politicians, you know, which are all in the hands of the US. Can you explain why we call this hijacking of democracy?
Again, the term democracy is supposed to mean self-determination. It's a group of people deciding for themselves how they're going to do things, how they're going to move their country forward, in what direction and how. If you have a foreign country interfering in virtually every aspect of your nation's socio-economic and political landscape, is that really self-determination? If the head of Myanmar's government was beholden to these supposed advisors, I think it's more accurate to call them handlers. There was another one, Joseph Fisher. He used to work at the British Embassy in Myanmar, and then he's an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi. And he's the one organizing her communications with other countries and press conferences and things like this. So again, it's not just Sean Turnell, it's also Joseph Fisher from the British Embassy. Could you imagine a Russian diplomat coming out of the embassy in Washington, D.C. and then hanging out in the Oval Office with the U.S. president? How unacceptable that would be, how instantly people would identify that as problematic. But here Aung San Suu Kyi is surrounded by this entourage of foreigners, of Americans, British, Australians, and people are acting as if this is normal. This is normal, and this is democracy, and that this was a democratically elected government, and not just a client regime hiding behind democracy. You said about hijacking. If we look at the National Endowment for Democracy funding, that they claim they're funding democracy, but what they're really doing is going into the country and creating a parallel to everything that's already in that country, parallel media that serves US interests, not the people of Myanmar's interests, legal groups, education, communication, resource management, literally everything a government is supposed to do. The US, through the National Endowment for Democracy, sets up a parallel organization. What they're doing is they're setting it up so that eventually it overwrites the indigenous institutions of any targeted country, including especially Myanmar. It's the NED's penetration of Myanmar's socio-political landscape is very deep, and they have taken over almost everything there. And again, this is why the military intervened.
Could you get back to NED, National Endowment for Democracy?
This is sort of a part 2 regarding Myanmar's opposition. In the previous video, I pointed out how this opposition is not a product of any sort of democratic process, how it is solely a product of foreign interference, how the US admits how it built up this opposition and practically installed them into power. I went over this document from the Burma Campaign UK, how they admit the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy and Open Society built this opposition up from A to Z. I also showed you how Open Society through George Soros was in direct connection to this 88 generation movement, these leaders, and how Pyon Cho would eventually end up as a member of Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy. Now, I'm talking about all of this because there is another connection to be made here, and this is with Aung San Suu Kyi, and this is another reason why Myanmar's military thought it was so important to take back control of the country. This is an article by AFP, published by Mizama, another US government-funded media outlet in Myanmar. Soros's Open Society urges release of staffer held in Myanmar. So Myanmar's military rounded up a bunch of Open Society staffers. There was also this: Myanmar detains Australian advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi. First known arrest of foreign national since coup. Why does Aung San Suu Kyi have a foreign advisor? Who is this guy? After I show you who Sean Turnell is and what he's been up to, I think it'll be very clear why they arrested him.
Sean Turnell is the senior advisor to, as they call her in country, the lady. He is with her all the time discussing economic and related issues, in particular around the banking sector and the macro.
He also works at this university, and he has been an advisor to the U.S. State Department and other agencies, to USAID, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to the World Bank, and Open Society. So he's got he's involved in many things, many aspects of foreign interference in Myanmar's internal political affairs, things Australia would never tolerate any other country doing to it, and yet he is doing this to Myanmar. Here is a document from Asia Society. This is one of these think tanks. It says Asia Society, but it's Western-centric and focuses on Western policy toward Asia. And this is actually current realities and future possibilities in Burma, Myanmar, options for U.S. policy. Asia Society Task Force report. And who is on this task force? This is from 2010. Wesley Clark, and a retired U.S. Army general. Henrietta Foray from USAID. There's also Sean Turnell. He's principal advisor. And you also have George Soros as a member. And if you go through this, it's all about U.S. policy towards Myanmar. So here, Sean Turnell is involved in crafting policy toward Myanmar, U.S. policy towards Myanmar. And then he is an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, whispering into her ear, trying to shape Myanmar's own internal policy and also their policy toward the U.S. And Sean Turnell is also part of this, the Development Institute. There he is. And here is the Myanmar Development Institute getting U.S. aid money. So do you see how it's just one tangled web of influence reaching into Myanmar? And Sean Turnell, practically with Aung San Suu Kyi on a leash, and with the people surrounding him, Open Society, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, the U.S. State Department, controlling and funding virtually every aspect of Aung San Suu Kyi's political machine, the electorate process inside of Myanmar. This was what was going on. This is why Myanmar's military had to take control. This is why they were rounding up people working for Open Society, because they were literally running the country, and they just had people like Aung San Suu Kyi as the Myanmar face for what was a neo-colonial administration. And what kind of things was Sean Turnell whispering into Aung San Suu Kyi's ear? Things like this: China's $7.5 billion Myanmar port is crazy, Suu Kyi advisor says. Who is the advisor? Sean Turnell. There he is. It is a client regime, and it wasn't even really being run by people in Myanmar, even though they were hand-selected by the U.S. and funded and backed and installed into power. They still had people like Sean Turnell actually running things. So this is why Myanmar's military took over, not because they hate democracy. Maybe they do, but this opposition had absolutely nothing to do with democracy. It was imperialism, and they were ousting a client regime run out of Washington, D.C. Thought this video was useful. Please like and share it. Think about subscribing to the channel. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description for these links. There's also ways you can help support my work so that I can continue doing videos like this. And as always, thank you for watching. As Myanmar's crisis continues to intensify, there is growing pressure being placed on the nations in Southeast Asia, on ASEAN. And this pressure is being placed on them by the so-called international community, which is just a euphemism for the West, for the United States, the UK, the European Union, and all of these other nations that go along with their foreign policy objectives. Now, what are they being pressured to do? They're not being pressured to end the conflict in Myanmar. They're being pressured to help advance Western foreign policy objectives regarding Myanmar. And so they've been using a handful of talking points to kind of pressure and shame Southeast Asian governments into going along with this. And so the first one that I hear often is the violence must end. And of course, the violence should end in Myanmar. But when they talk about violence, they're only talking about the military and police using violence. They are not talking about the opposition attacking them, provoking violence, and they're not even talking about the now admitted armed ethnic groups that are involved in fighting the government now, or the fact that the so-called peaceful protesters have war weapons they claim are coming from these ethnic armed groups. So this is an armed conflict, and if you want an armed conflict to stop, you need to address the violence on both sides, not just one side. That is a recipe for the prevailing side to just exterminate the other side, like what happened in Libya, where they're still killing each other to this very day. That's what the U.S. wants to turn Myanmar into. So ASEAN leaders and diplomats and people in the media, beware of that. That's what you're helping contribute to when you repeat these talking points. The second one is Myanmar must return to democracy. There was never any democracy in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy were created by the US and British governments. They are a product of foreign interference. They are not democracy. They are not a democratic party. They are agents of a foreign government acting on their behalf and completely dependent on their support financially and politically. There is an enormous network created and funded every year by the US government in Myanmar. You can just go to the National Endowment for Democracy's own website and look. There's over 80 programs there. Interfering in virtually every aspect of Myanmar's internal political affairs. If you hold an election in that sort of environment, it could never, by any stretch of the imagination, be considered free and fair. So it is impossible for Myanmar to return to democracy. The only thing that's possible is for ASEAN to be made by the US to force Myanmar's military to allow the US client regime back into power. That's what they actually mean when they say return to democracy. Now, the third and final one is Myanmar's military must stop defying world opinion. So if international community is a euphemism for the West, then world opinion is a euphemism for whatever Western propaganda is promoting. So let's look at the narratives that we're being told about Myanmar. We're only hearing one side of the story. Facebook, Twitter, Google, they all bragged about how they removed Myanmar's government from all of their platforms. Their side of the story isn't being told here. And all we're hearing is from the BBC or Reuters or Voice of America or CNN or all of these US government-funded fronts in Myanmar pretending to be independent media outlets. That's the only information that we're getting now out of Myanmar. So if there is a real world opinion, it is grossly misinformed because it was only told one side of the story. This is what the US did in Iraq in 2003 in the lead up to the invasion. This is what they did to Libya and Syria in 2011. It's what they did in Ukraine in 2014, Hong Kong more recently, and also here in Thailand. They lie about everything, and now they're lying about Myanmar. So these are the three talking points that I hear all the time. The politicians, the diplomats, the media, the people living in ASEAN need to really ask themselves, do you really want to sleepwalk into another US-backed regime change crisis? Look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at Ukraine. The only place you can look at and not see an absolute nightmare is Hong Kong because China stopped it before it turned into a nightmare. So ASEAN needs to ask themselves how they can do that in Myanmar. If you thought the video was useful, please like and share. Try to get the word out there to people. Subscribe to the channel because that helps the channel grow and it's free to do. Look in the video description for ways you can help support my work. And as always, thank you for watching.